Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're venturing into the darkest corners of America's wilderness, places where the trail ends, the road bends, and the night swallows every sound. I'll be sharing a collection of true encounters and chilling legends from remote mountains, shadowed forests, and lonely backroads across the country. These aren't campfire myths. These are real experiences that linger long after the sun goes down. So grab a blanket, kill the lights, and settle in for a journey where beauty meets terror. Don't forget to subscribe, drop a like, and share your own eerie stories in the comments. Now, let's begin. Story 1. The chimney that kept breathing. The first mistake was trusting the sky. It had been bright when I started up the old logging cut, that hard winter brightness that makes the bark look oiled and the laurel leaves snap like folded tin. I thought I had 3 hours to tag the boundary tree and be back at the truck before weather got any ideas. But the ridge held its own plans, and by the time I realized the trail had narrowed into a deer path, the wind had soured and made a sound like a bottle rim when you run a wet finger around it. I cut across a slope to save time and stepped into a mess of rhododendron that tried to hold me where I stood. When the rain came, it came sideways, a hard, mean sheet, and the temperature fell like a trap door. I wasn't looking for a cabin so much as a roofline, anything with a pitch to shake water instead of drinking it. That's how I saw it through the laurel. A tilt of grey boards, door hanging crooked from one hinge, windows emptied out so clean it looked like someone had unbuttoned the house. The chimney was the best kept piece, black brick stacked steady, hardly a lean to it. I was grateful for that before anything else. A good chimney means a roof didn't have to do all the work. I ducked under the door and felt the floor give under my heel. Not break, not yet. Just flex, the way rotten planks learn to do when they like to pretend they're still part of a house. The room was single and simple, a bed frame without ropes, a table with 3 legs and a rock serving as the 4th, a coil of baling wire slumped in the corner like a dead snake. I set my pack by the hearth because that's the old habit. Keep your things close to where heat ought to be. I leaned into the chimney and felt a draft cool my eyebrows, a steady pull like a tunnel breathing. The rain crowded the roof, but down in that brick throat the sound was soft and even, almost patient. I told myself it was a good sign. A chimney that pulls means smoke won't sit down and choke you if you get a fire lit. I found a few dry scrap ends inside the wood box by the door. Someone had saved the heart of old floorboards years back, and the resin held. I built a small pyramid tight against the back brick and tried a match, but the wind working the flue ate the flame sidewise. It licked the sticks and went out, a polite rejection. I tried again with my stove instead, boiling water for coffee I didn't need as much as I needed the ritual of it. Metal warming, steam lifting, the sweet lie that you're in control when you make hot things in a cold place. Outside, the rain paused without stopping, as if the ridge had learned to sigh. That's when I noticed my own breath had picked up a partner. Inhale, exhale, then the chimney pulled with me, a heartbeat behind. I held my breath to break the joke. The chimney drew anyway, one long swallow that made the hair on my arms stand like wheat. I've been in old houses that talk. Loose panes, mice nestings, rafters remembering a storm better than you do. I put the coffee tin on the table and pulled a plank from the bed frame, wedged it across the fireplace opening to break the draft. The wood fit easy, as if the space had measured it already. The pull muffled but didn't stop. It changed with a wet edge now, like the stones in there had learned to swallow the way a mouth does when someone walks into a room you don't trust. I was tired enough to be angry at the feeling. I pushed my sleeping bag toward the far wall, where the floor seemed less in a hurry to forget what it was. The rain came back serious. The house tightened. Water found the seam by the window and traced a clean line down the wall. I listened to the chimney breathe and told myself drafts and pressure were simple facts, not a language. Somewhere around the time you start losing track of your own body in a cold room, I slept. I know because I woke to the smell of ash without the comfort of heat, that clean mineral dry that belongs to yesterday's fires and old hair on old coats. Moonlight might have helped if there'd been any. There wasn't. What there was, what waited in the dim grey, were marks in the fine powder I'd made when I wedged the plank. Not smears from my boot heel or rodent scurry. These were little crescents laid in a curve, each print the size of my palm and as neat as a child pressing their hand into flour. They began at the hearth and walked to the door. I didn't bother talking myself out of what I was seeing. There are moments when your head understands you better than your mouth does. I didn't try the door. I didn't turn my head to where the knob sat like a brass eye. I stared at the ash until the night itself seemed to weigh less, which is one of the ways you can feel dawn. When it came embarrassed, thin light that remembered what it had promised late yesterday and hated itself for delivering so little. The chimney fell quiet with it. The pull gone like the last note of a song you can't bring back. I lifted the plank from the fireplace and set it aside. The ash inside the hearth had settled into a shallow bowl, as if something heavy had rested there and learned to lower itself by degrees. Outside the cabin, the world kept a more practical story. Laurels shone slick and black, the cut filled with runoff. Bird prints stitched the mud by the sill, but the chimney brick carried a patch of fresh green moss pressed flat along the mortar in a shape that wasn't a happenstance. An oval with a little rise at one edge, a geometry you only learn by kissing something with intention. I touched it and my finger came away cold and clean. No grit, no smear. It felt like something that had just happened. I thought about the curve of prints in the ash and understood the hunger you can have for a narrative that makes sense even if it offends all your instincts. Raccoons, I said to the trees, because sometimes it helps to throw a lie into the air and see if the ridge throws it back. I packed slow, partly because the floor laughed at the idea of haste, and partly because I kept looking at that moss print and expecting it to breathe. I left the cabin cleaner than I'd found it. That's courtesy, and it keeps your brain busy with decent chores. I wiped the table, righted the rock that served as the leg, rolled the wire coil into a smaller coil. When I shouldered my pack, I realized how quiet I'd become, how careful with noise, like sound belonged to someone else and I was borrowing it. Outside, the rain had given up and left the ground to its own devices. I took 3 steps toward the cut and stopped because a side wind moved across the yard with the deliberate pace of a person deciding where to stand. It wasn't cold, it wasn't warm, it was occupied, and it came from the direction of the chimney, and it matched my breathing for a spell before it learned its own rhythm and wandered off into the laurel. On the way down, I tried to mark the place the way you do when you think you might want to find it again or avoid it forever. Bent a branch here, scratch on bark there, but the mountain knows those tricks and forgives them too quickly. I made it back to the truck, and the truck started, and that should be the end of some stories. At the first curve where the gravel turns back on itself, I checked the mirror out of habit. What I expected to see was my own face gone long from a night that hadn't fed me. What I saw instead was the fog still in the bed of the truck, a low grey fill that didn't tumble out with the road's motion, that rose and fell once like a sleeping chest, then thinned into ordinary air. I didn't pull over. I didn't pray. I didn't decide it meant anything. I drove. That night, back home, the wood stove in my own little house gave a good, normal warmth and put the room in order the way a squared-away fire does. I sat on the floor close to it, a habit from when I was younger and believed proximity could solve things. Maybe I fell asleep there. Maybe I never really slept well again. At some hour with no number attached, the stovepipe made a sound like a throat clearing. Not a sharp tick, not expansion, a small, wet swallow, polite as a guest. I held my breath and waited for it to match me. It didn't. The silence that followed was the cleanest I've ever heard. In the morning, there was a smear of soot on the back of my hand about the size and shape of a mouth. I washed it twice. Some stains are only stubborn because of what they ask you to remember. I went on with my day. And if sometimes a draft moves across the floor of my house with the slow confidence of something arriving, I let it. I'd rather not know what language a mountain learns when people stop listening. Story 2. The mattress with 2 heartbeats. You can tell when a cabin wasn't just a place to get out of the rain. The boards hold a smell that doesn't come from weather. Lye worked hard into knots, sour soap, the stale sweetness of cigarettes and cloth that hasn't moved in years. This one sat high on a side spur where the spruce went stunted and the stones bled rust down the slope like old wounds. The trail up was more suggestion than path, just crushed fern and the memory of boot tread. The roof held with a stubborn slant, which was all I asked by the time the light went thin. Inside, the curtains were stiff as paper and the windows only opened a finger before something insisted they'd done enough. I told myself the lie meant someone cared once. I told myself a lot of things I didn't believe. The mattress was a slumped thing in the corner, ticking stain to the color of weak tea, springs showing in places like ribs through torn cloth. I didn't want it, but the floor was a map of soft spots and screwed down boards, and it was already colder than the air should have been. I unrolled my bag on top, testing each inch with my palm. No give I couldn't live with, no smell I couldn't ignore if I kept my face turned away. Wind combed the trees and the cabins sang back in the old harmonies, framed walls being reminded of their nails, stovepipe popping a few quiet thoughts, something in the loft clicking like a cooling engine, familiar music. I made a quick meal on my little burner and let the canister run a minute longer than I needed, just to have the sound of a human-made flame. Then I shut it off, and the ridge settled around the cabin like a lid. Sometime after midnight, the wind went flat. It's a thick kind of silence when a ridge stops moving. You hear your own blood like a fault. That's when the first thump started, low and steady, deep under my spine where the mattress decided my weight belonged. Thump, thump. So slow and even it landed on the wrong side of natural. At first I blamed the stove, old pipes knocking, metal expanding in some forgotten run. But there was no pipe for it to be. And the sound wasn't in the room, it was under me, inside the mattress. Like a hand smacking the drumhead from below and resting there to feel the skin vibrate. I pressed 2 fingers to my neck and counted off, trying to find the trick of my own pulse. The rhythm under me didn't care. I held my breath. It didn't falter. It was nothing to do with me. The second beat came in jittering, higher in the bed near my knees. Not a match for the first, not arguing with it either. Just anxious, quick, like someone speaking over a patient voice. 2 rhythms ran out of time with each other and made a third thing in the room, a shape built from interference. I told myself noise travels in strange ways through old wood. I told myself the slope under us was talking to rocks I couldn't see. But the springs tensed under my back the way a person's back tenses when someone climbs on, and a looseness crawled into my gut that had nothing to do with hunger. I slid off the mattress to the floor. The fast beat went quiet, as if I'd insulted it by leaving. The slow one followed me across the boards anyway, moving through the wood like a palm smoothing a blanket, stopping where I stopped, keeping company without asking. I turned my headlamp on and kept the beam low, not for any reason I could justify. Light showed me what daylight had hidden. Weird carefulness. A strip of torn sheet had been tied around one leg of the bed like a tourniquet, holding it to a nail in the floor. The window latches had fresh scratches. Someone had made sure they'd close and keep closing. In the corner, under the stove where soot falls and mice make their decisions, a little cluster of things had been swept together. A brown glass bottle stamped with embossing that said carbolic. 2 safety pins bent open and splayed. A length of rubber tubing cracked to the point of uselessness. I reached to move the bottle and saw the label underneath it. A rectangle of paper worn to a thumbprint that said, in a schoolteacher hand, "Sarah, listen for 2 hearts. No date, no last name." Just that, and the lye smell suddenly louder. I lifted the corner of the mattress and looked under. Cotton batting had clumped and turned the color of bruised fruit. In one place, someone had stitched up a long tear. The thread was neat, too neat for a fix made for looks. Whoever did it sewed to keep something from getting out. I pressed 2 knuckles into the ticking and it gave back. Warm where the room wasn't. Not hot, not fresh. Warm like something had been resting there a long time and had only recently been convinced to move. The slow beat ticked on, unembarrassed. I set a tin cup on the mattress to see if it would dance the way cups do when a train goes by. It didn't. The sound never shook a thing it didn't want to. It only found me. Maybe you think I'm the kind of fool who cuts a mattress open in the dark in a place with 1 door and a lot of history. I thought about it. I held the knife. I imagined what the batting would hold. Mouse nests, a sewer of dust, a dark shape I would move with the blade and learn to regret. In the end, I sat in the chair and put my boots on. I put my back against the door because it seemed polite to offer myself as a hinge if something insisted on entering. The beats ran a while like a metronome set for 2 different songs in the same room. Then, the quick one lost patience and faded to a little skitter you could call nerves if nerves had bodies. The slow one lessened from thump to hum, a presence practicing absence. When a grey that wasn't light yet began to show edges in the room, both were gone. By dawn, my sleeping bag was damp where my shoulders had tensed and sweated without permission. I pushed my palm into the spot where I'd lain and felt it. Heat still gathered where no sun touched, a long oval like a body's after image cooling slow. The rest of the bed was ordinary cold, only that place kept a memory. I pulled the mattress off the frame to see if weight had worn a groove. The springs sagged in a shape that wasn't mine, smaller, narrower in the hips, deeper by the ribs. Along the side of the frame someone had carved dates with the point of a knife. 5 of them notched into pine. 4 lines had little circles next to them. The last didn't. Beside the last date, a word cut light, but deliberate, like the person doing it didn't want to get caught even by themselves. Keep. I put the mattress back like a liar making a bed. The hike down was longer than the climb because I kept looking back, listening for a pace that would give itself away. The spruce stayed busy with their own concerns. The rocks bled rust and kept counsel. At the truck, I sat with the door open until the seat soaked up my damp and made a heat of its own. I told myself a story about water noise and wind under boards. I told myself someone had taught this place to hold still for a while, to keep people out of reach of each other and the world. You don't have to decide if something is holy or ruined to treat it with respect. You can leave quickly and beautifully at the same time. That night in my own house, my bed made its normal complaints when I lay down. One spring sticking with loyalty to a bad habit, the frame sighing because I never found its wobble. Rain touched the roof easy, no mountain to push it mean. I slept because I thought I had earned it. Sometime toward morning, I woke with my hand under my cheek and felt a small drum, the kind your pulse makes in the fat pad below the thumb. It wasn't mine. It ran fast and bright against my palm, pleased to be noticed. I moved my hand away, and the rhythm kept time in the pillow. It slowed and slowed until it matched something that might have been a house settling, or a ridge remembering, or a body deciding. When I got up, I found a safety pin open on the floor by the bed. I don't own safety pins. I bent it shut, careful as you do when you don't want to be the one to break what's still holding. Then I made coffee and kept quiet about it. Some cabins only stop using you when you stop giving them words. Story 3. The Window That Refused the Night. I've always liked the small lie a window tells you. It puts a layer of glass between you and whatever waits outside. And if the pane's clean enough, you can pretend the night's pressed against it, nose to the cold, while you keep your lamp and your thoughts safe on your side. That's what I was counting on when I took the cabin. One room tucked into the bend of a hollow where the spruce lean in close to hear their own needles. I set my lantern on the sill and listened to beans behave in a dented pan. The window had that antique wave, glass poured in a time that made everything look like it was breathing. The trees bowed and recovered in it, and my own face bobbed along behind them, a little foolish, a little tired, but present. I trimmed the wick when the flame guttered and felt a small satisfaction when it rose steady again. Then the smallest thing went wrong. My reflection winked out first, not a dim or a blur. 1 second I was there. The next, the glass offered me nothing back. I stood too close, kicked my hip against the table and jolted the lantern, which didn't help because the room stayed the room and the glass kept ignoring me. Instead, it put up a picture I hadn't earned. The hollow looked longer than it had in daylight, stretched like a sheet being pulled straight. Deeper down, beyond the familiar notch of 2 poplars, a path ran pale as chalk between trunks. I hadn't noticed any path when I came in. Just a mess of ferns and a run of stones that pretended to be steps but had never been. I moved the lantern left, then right. The view moved with it. The pane wasn't reflecting anymore. It was watching, fixed on what the night had decided I should see. I told myself there was a clean logic to it. Old glass takes light, odd, moonrise fools depth. A body hungry for a decent story will invent one to go with the light in the eye. That's the sort of nonsense that keeps you brave enough to eat alone. The lantern ran low. I blew it out to save fuel and sat in the dark with the wind learning the roof. The pane still glowed, a flat, patient brightness that didn't deserve a moon, seeing as clouds had climbed the ridge and swallowed it whole. If you've ever put your palm to leftover heat on a stove after the fire's long turned to thought, it was like that, light remembering itself. The path in that too bright rectangle stayed clean and inviting, chalk on bark, and I couldn't stop tracking it with my eyes even when I told myself to sleep. I dragged my bag onto the bed frame and promised to lie with my back to the glass. I didn't keep the promise. Every noise went through the window first. An owl trading notes with something lower in the creek grass, a fox's complaint stitched into needles, a board settling under a memory of weight. None of it alarmed me the way the good sense of that path did. It had dimensions no trail deserves in the dark. It wasn't a line drawn in by fancy, wasn't a rabbit run grown up with myth. It looked like a decision. When the cabin settles enough, you can hear your joints. You know you've crossed midnight. Around 3, I fell up out of a shallow kind of sleep because the pane brightened as if someone had raised a shade in the sky. Something white and low crossed the path. I didn't make more of it than that because accuracy is often kinder than imagination. It didn't lift a head or change its pace. It skimmed close to the ground like a shirt you might drag if your hands were full of something you didn't want to drop. It paused at a place that, by my reckoning, should have been the cabin, the pain, the idiot in the bed. It waited the way a person waits on a doorstep when they aren't sure of their welcome. Then it kept going, down slope, obedient to a gravity I could not improve by naming. I don't know how long after that I stayed awake watching the absence of things. When clouds finally tore themselves into smaller clouds and moonscraps stitched the hollow, the window still refused me. It would not put me back where I belonged. I woke to the humming cold that means morning even before light will admit it exists. The pain had gone dull again. The old wave returned. The room restored to the room. My face showed up thin and criminally ordinary. I tried the latch for the stupid comfort of it. It stuck halfway open and refused further, as if the cabin had decided how much air I deserved. Outside, the yard held dew the way a breath holds a name. Where the hollow should have been its usual rough, a clean line ran through the grass like chalk dragged straight across a slate too long forgotten. I stepped onto it and felt nothing. I walked a dozen paces down and found that the ground remembered being flat where it wasn't, as if boots had taught it manners. The line carried past the poplars and took the old slope with a convenience that mocked the rest of the land. I didn't follow. You learn when you're young in these hills that mercy sometimes looks like obedience, and the mountain will let you be if you let it be right. I tried to think the path into a human story because we all do that when the land does something we don't approve of. Old survey cut, I decided, though no paint marked the trees. Maybe a logging drag, though the ruts weren't there. Maybe a garden row from when the cabin kept a family and the family still owed children to someone else. Back inside, I looked for evidence of the last names that matter, penciled measures on a door jamb, a calendar saved for its picture and not its months, a nail bent to hold a coat that never made it back. The only thing I found was a scrap of mirror in a tin frame nailed above the washstand. It was too small to use for much. You could shave by it if you were gentle and didn't care if you missed a corner. I picked it up because handling an object does more for your courage than any prayer I know. The mirror showed me clean, obedient, unremarkable. When I turned toward the window to see what it made of the glass, the mirror gave me back a square of daylight and my own eye. The window, behind my reflection in the mirror, was still stuck on its private view, the path bright like a rule. I set the mirror down and the pain returned to ordinary life. It was a relief in the way being believed is a relief and also a crime. I left because leaving seemed like the correct ceremony. I latched the window as far as it would go and knotted a string around the latch for the trouble I was sure it would give someone else. I swept the crumbs, laid the spoon on the shelf, sharp end tucked in where it wouldn't stab a passerby's careless hand. At the door, I looked back to insult the fear with one last glance. The pain threw me my face and a sliver of the hollow, nothing more. Halfway to the truck, I lost sight of the cabin and, with it, the sense of being watched by a thing that isn't eyes. The road out was rough where it had always been rough. An old sign at the first fork had fallen and taken its message with it. I drove out in low gear and let the engine write its own letter to the climb. At home that night, the bedroom window faces nothing but my neighbor's maple, which is close enough to count squirrels and far enough to forget her name. The glass is new and has no wave to teach it a better way to see. I lay awake anyway, the brain going its little circles. Around the hour where the good sleep turns thin, a brightness pulled at the edge of the shade. I sat up before I could talk myself out of it. The pain was ordinary, my wall, my lamp, my small life. In the black square of the television screen across the room, caught in the off reflection that screens like to keep to themselves, a pale path ran across trees that weren't mine. It wasn't long, just enough to flag the mind like a hand raised in a crowd, It led from a place just left of where a cabin might be down toward where belief gets soft. I could have crossed the room and put my hand on the glass to prove the screen a liar and the window a friend. I didn't. Morning came because it always does, and the maple learned a new bird, and work waited with its plain face on. But every evening since, I've touched the shade with 2 fingers before the dark fully arrives, and I've told the night to stay where it belongs. It does, mostly. On the nights when it refuses, I keep my eyes for the lamps I know and let any stray path find its way through other rooms than mine. Story 4. The Pantry, with no corners. You learn to trust what cabins teach you, even when the lesson feels wrong in your hands. This one sat off a cut that hadn't seen a truck in 20 years, little place tucked into the notch where a creek ran itself quiet, and the stairs went up steep as a ladder to a loft that wouldn't take a full-grown man's posture. I'd come late, beating weather by maybe an hour, and I wanted only dry boards and some privacy to boil water in. Under those stairs was a pantry no taller than my ribs, shelves sawed from old fence slats, the smell of mouse and that old-time soap that stings your nose with lye. It looked perfect for stowing my pack away from teeth. I slid it in and put the stove on the table, and then I saw it. The wrongness. No corners. Where 2 walls should have met in a clean right angle, there was a soft, tight curve, as if water had rubbed the wood round and closed the seam like a healed cut. I pressed my palm to it and felt a give that wasn't rot. When I tried to wedge a splinter into the seam pushed back like gum and kept its shape. I told myself some sensible story. People rounded corners to keep rats from nesting, or to make sweeping easier, or because the boards came from a barrel and nobody had money for square. It's a relief to talk like that in your own head. I cooked, ate quick, and kept an ear on the creek. The light went from tannin to bone. The bugs changed shift. The roof did that slow stretching a house does after it's decided to keep you. Every time my eyes came back to the pantry, I had the same feeling. Not a doorway, not a closet, not a box for food. A mouth, not open, but kept in a polite line, waiting to be spoken to. I moved my pack closer to the front edge just to see if anything in me unclenched. It didn't. I chalked a line on the floor, a half circle where the pack sat, the way you mark a tire before you jack a car, to catch a liar in motion. After dark, the quiet came, in pieces. You know the order if you've slept in old places. The last bird that doesn't believe in schedule, the mouse that scolds anyway, the creek practicing its vowels. The roof deciding which nail to complain through. I set my lamp down to save fuel, and let the coals in the stove turn into the kind of thought you can warm your hands at without seeing. That's when the clicking started inside the pantry. Not frantic, not the scatter of a trapped thing. Calm, patient. 2 slow clicks, a pause, 1 click, another. Counting itself, I thought, and I didn't like how quick my brain supplied the word. I held still and listened until the clicks faded into the creek's even talk, and I could tell myself I'd mislaid them. When I checked the chalk an hour later, the line was smeared into a neat arc. 1 sweep, tongue wide. My pack had slid an inch backward without the polite courtesy of a slope. I moved the pack out and put the stove closer, as if heat could make the space forget its plans. Warmth woke a smell in there, wet leather and old rope, the odor of tack pulled from a barn after a storm. I lifted the bottom shelf, half expecting to find a pipe or a burrow. The shelf pried up easy and showed nothing but a floor that had learned the same trick. At the juncture of board to board, a curve, tight and smooth, no dark seam for dust to claim. I took the lamp and shined down the rounded joints. Light walked them without a catch. When I turned the lamp off, the The wood seemed to hold a little of the bright on its own, as if the grain had kept a memory it had no business keeping. I set my ear near the rounding and heard the creak through it more clearly than through the open door. A soft pulse ran under the sound, matching the water's fall, like a throat finding a beat to sing to. I lay down and tried to behave like someone who believed in sleep. The cabin settled on top of me, familiar weight, and my eyes dragged back to the black of the pantry the way a tongue finds a sore tooth. The wood changed with dark. It didn't move. It wore the night differently. Those curves where corners were supposed to be swelled a fraction with each creak pulse, not enough to swear on in daylight, enough that my body knew it. I told myself to count breaths, to give the ridge what it wanted, a person who knew how to be quiet. I got halfway into the rhythm before something touched the floorboards outside the pantry. One soft thing, then another. Not a footstep so much as a press. The rounded seam nearest the door trembled and went still. When I sat up, the tremble returned and ran along the curve as if a finger traced it from inside. Slow, polite, asking permission to learn the shape. I don't scare easy at the kind of noises people make when they're sneaking. There's a grammar to it, hesitations, weight shifts, the little breath that gives a man away when he thinks he's without a face. This wasn't that. Whatever pressed at the wood kept perfect time with the creak, no greed in it, no hurry. I reached for my knife and felt ashamed of the gesture. Stabbing a pantry seemed like an argument you lose by winning. Instead, I talked aloud the way my grandfather did when a bear passed through his yard. "You keep on then," I said. "Ain't nothing here for you." The pressing stopped. A vague relief washed up my spine and left grit behind. I don't know when I slept. I know I woke at the hour when the ridge turns from night animal to day animal. My mouth tasted like I'd chewed a rope. The lamp had burned out and the stove was pure thought, no ember left to lie about. In the grey that doesn't commit to being light, the pantry looked wider. That's a foolish sentence unless you've seen a space decide its edges again. The front shelf had more room under it, the way a coat loosens after someone has shrugged 2 sizes of sorrow out of it. The chalk on the floor had been lapped clean to a faint ghost, and just beyond where the line had been, a neat oval of damp, the shape you get when a mouth lays itself soft on a board and breathes there a while. I put my hand over the oval and found the wood warmer than the room. It had cooled by the time I convinced myself to take my hand away, but the skin of my palm held a tacky sweetness, sap thick, like I'd touched raw pine. The shelves smelled new cut, though they'd been old when my father was guessing at corners. I stocked the pantry without admitting I was doing it as a trade. Salt, rice, a tin of peaches I'd been saving for a meaner night. 2 tea bags folded like a small apology. I said nothing ceremonial. I didn't ask for a blessing or promise not to come back. I just set the things in a row along the rounded seam, where edges go to learn a different grammar, and stepped away. The air inside warmed and let off that leather smell again, but under it was something like clean earth after hard rain. I felt foolish and also obedient, which is a combination that keeps you alive more often than pride does. My pack went on my back with a will I hadn't had the night before. I swept, shut the stove's mouth, and left the door on its latch the same way I found it. Outside, the creek kept its same old song, and the path down remembered my feet without complaint. At the bend where the laurel makes its crowd, I looked back. From that angle, the cabin didn't show a door at all, just the understairs shadow like a second mouth waiting to be named. I got home before the weather found its voice. My kitchen has more corners than it needs, all of them square, all of them honest. I made tea and watched the steam choose a direction. Late that night, moving in the dark without a lamp, I brushed my hip along the cabinet by the sink and felt a curve where carpenters never left one. I put my palm to the joint and felt the slightest give, smooth as bone, warm as breath held to listen. I took my hand away and told myself tomorrow I'd sand it back, dress it square, remind the house what a corner's for. I haven't. Some nights the walls accept their angles and keep quiet. Some nights a soft pulse runs through the seams in time with a rain I can't see, and the kitchen smells like wet leather. I leave a tin on the shelf those nights, something sweet, and sleep in the chair with my feet off the floor, like a guest who remembers how to be kept. Story 5. The Steps That Returned Footprints. The old place sat at the end of a spur road nearly swallowed by broom straw, the kind you only find by following a fence line until it gives up being a fence and turns into memory. The porch leaned just enough to make you think about your weight, and when I went up the steps, the third tread sang that tired mountain note. Thin nails, old grain, a sound like a breath catching. 5 steps, I counted. A habit my father left in me the same way he left me his bad knee. Inside looked like every cabin that ever pretended to be empty. A bird's nest stuck in the stovepipe like a rag. A metal cup on the windowsill whitening with mineral. A calendar that stopped on a year people in these parts try not to name. The bed was shoved against the door from the inside, which I told myself was to keep out draft, though the draft came anyway. I should have turned around then, but rain was lining up on the ridge, so I set a little fire and held my hands out as if the room might be generous. When darkness found me, it did it slow, easing in at the corners until the world reduced to the stove's patience and the dull picture in the window. Yard, fog, the ghost of a fence. Some time passed when the logs have burned to thought. I heard feet on the steps. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 4, 5. Firm enough to be a person, light enough to be someone who learned to move without trouble. I waited for the porch to complain, for the boards to tell on whoever had made it that far, waited for the knob to test the latch, but nothing followed. Just that pause at the top, like a breath held with a hand over it. Then the feet went down again. 5, 4, 3. Pause. 2, 1. As careful as a child learning to count, I closed the damper on the fire and let the room go dim around me. The steps came back. Same measure, same patience, going up and down until I knew the rhythm as well as my name. It was steady as a creek in drought, no hurry and no hunger in it, and the steadiness, more than the sound, is what unnerved me. The animals here don't practice. Whatever this was had all night. I eased to the window and lifted the edge of the curtain with 2 fingers. The yard held fog the way a mouth holds breath, full and not moving. If there was a shape out there, it wore the night perfectly. The steps ran again. I could feel the drum of them in my forearms where they pressed the sill, but the boards just beyond the window stayed still as furniture. I told myself wind was teasing loose boards beneath the steps, told myself the earth settles and wood speaks and I was overtired. I told myself this a dozen times, and the counting outside kept time with my lying. It stopped sometime after I started hearing my own pulse in my teeth. I lay back on the bed and kept my boots on, because leaving is a skill you don't unlearn. When morning finally arrived embarrassed, pushing colour into the pines like it had forgotten how, I opened the door slow enough to keep the hinges from choosing a side. The dew was thick and honest. I could see my own tread across the yard from last night, and I followed it to the steps more to prove I could than for any sense it would make. The prints were there, bare, narrow, the kind you get from a lifetime without a shoe to teach your foot to lie, and the toes pointed up. They climbed to the top tread and stopped like the person had stood on the edge and become weather. At the bottom, a second set began, pointing down, and those faded into grass as if the earth had decided to keep what it had been offered. Between the top and the door there was nothing, Not even damp, disturbed where a hem would have brushed. My own boot marks reached the threshold and then thinned to almost nothing, as if the cabin had learned me and decided against keeping the lesson. I touched the third step and felt a warmth left over that didn't belong to the sun. I didn't stay for coffee. I put the bed back where it belonged, out of a respect I didn't want to feel. Closed the stove's mouth and backed down those steps the way you leave a room where someone is sleeping and you love them enough not to test how deep. On the way to the truck, I looked once over my shoulder and saw nothing but fog, remembering it had been fog. Back home, my own porch greeted me like it always does, blunt and square. That night, when the house settled, I heard 1, 2, 3, pause, 4, 5 inside the rhythm of the rain, not loud enough to swear by and too exact to forget. I went to the door and laid my palm on it and felt nothing at all, which is sometimes worse. In the morning, the dew on my steps wore only one set of footprints, mine, and those faded quick. I swept anyway, just in case the wood here had learned a new secret in the night and needed me to keep it. Story 6. The Stove That Cooked Without Flame. I trusted that stove the way you trust a farmer's handshake. Iron, honest, heavy enough to keep its promises. The cabin was nothing much. A one-room box parked on a shoulder of the ridge where the spruce give way to sourwood. But the stove sat dead center like a heart. Its mouth yawned wide when I swung the door. And inside there was nothing to brag about. No split sticks, no nest of yesterday's coals, just a ring of soot that looked like a grin that had grown tired of explaining itself. I set my little burner on the table to boil water because I didn't have time to nurse a real fire, and the light was already turning grainy. Then I stepped outside to split kindling from a fallen fence rail. The sort of work you do by feel when the mountain's got that wet weight to its breath. When I came back, the cabin air was different, like a kitchen on Sunday, when somebody decides to make a thing that takes time. My burner had sputtered out, but the pot was steaming anyway, lids quivering on the stove like it was laughing in its throat. I touched the stovetop and snatched back my hand. Heat, clean, steady, the kind you get after an hour of good flame, not the flash of a canister. The room smelled faintly of broth. I opened the stove door expecting to see a trick. Pilot flame, ember, some leftover blaze I'd missed. Nothing showed but a low orange hum, not light so much as a pressure your eyes wanted to call light. Coals that had chosen not to glow, I thought. And then I hated that thought because it made no sense and felt correct anyway. I put a pan of beans inside for a dare and sat on the floor cross-legged where I could watch. The hum deepened when I looked away, softened when I faced it, like a shy thing that worked best without an audience. The beans came out tender, skins barely broken, tasting like time had passed kindly. I should have been grateful. Instead, it felt like somebody had fixed me a plate without asking what I was hungry for, and that kind of kindness lives close to control. I ate and kept my ears open the way you do when you're alone somewhere that's borrowed you for the night. Roof ticking into place, wind combing the laurel. The old boards rehearsing their complaints so they won't have to wake you later. Dark folds around a person different in a cabin than it does in a tent. It has the manners of a guest who knows the door latch. Around midnight, with the stove settled into its quiet work, I heard metal touch metal on the table. I hadn't unpacked a spoon yet. I'd eaten straight from the pan. But there it lay beside the plate I hadn't set. A cheap camp spoon dented along the bowl by teeth small and many, the way a jar lid looks after a raccoon proposes to it and gives up. I picked it up, and the dents lined my thumb perfectly, each small bite shallow but sure. I told myself it had been like that when I bought it, a factory mistake, a memory gone sideways. I set it back down, and the hum inside the stove gave one pleased swell before sinking into itself again. The night went on like a person telling a story too close to you to refuse. I left a slice of cornbread on top of the stove because it felt polite to do something that wasn't pretending. Sleep took me quick in the chair by the door, boots still on, knife still sheathed. I woke to a ring of ash, neat as a plate, where the cornbread had been, a place setting drawn in grey, no crumbs anywhere else. The air held that broth smell again, a little sweeter, and under it a leather note like the inside of a tack room after rain. I lifted the lid on the stove and slid a page from my field notebook under it, the only thing I could think to offer that wasn't food or fear. "Thank you," I wrote, "but please don't follow." It felt like telling a creek not to learn the path to your porch. Morning came proper, blue and brisk, and I moved through my chores quiet, like I didn't want to wake anything that was already awake. The stovetop was cool to the touch, ordinary iron pretending to have never warmed me at all. I packed slow, wiped the table, closed the stove's mouth with a gentleness that embarrassed me, and stepped out into a yard that had decided to remember sunlight. Down the trail, in the stretch where the ground holds last night's story better than the slope above it, I saw where something small had sat in the leaf mold and left no shape, the way a warm body leaves only a difference in frost. Maybe I imagined that. Maybe I wanted to. Back home, my own stove behaved like stoves do. Wood, match, smoke that minds you if you mind it. Still, some nights when I turn my head to pour coffee or answer a thought, the heat deepens without flame. The pot licks into a boil before it earns it, and the room picks up that broth smell like a tune remembered. I keep a spoon beside the plate anyway. I check it in the morning. The dents hold their count. I haven't heard the small teeth again, and I don't plan to leave a note twice. Courtesy is easy where roads are, but there are other routes, and if something takes them, I don't need to know their names. Story 7. The Door That Swung Inward. Twice. The cabin was one of those square little boxes that sits where a road loses courage, and the door had the kind of latch you respect because it's older than your reasons. I tested it the way you do when you're alone, pushed, pulled, lifted, set, and it answered me with a tired metal catch that sounded like relief. I took 3 steps into the room, and it sighed, and came open a finger's width, polite as a hostess who won't take your coat. I stuffed a strip of shirt in the strike, wedged a stick under the bottom, braced a chair against the knob so its back legs bit into the floor. Outside, the laurel pressed up to the porch rail like a crowd trying to hear. Inside, I put the stove to a thoughtful burn and unrolled my bag on the part of the floor that felt least interested in remembering it used to be a tree. When the ridge went from evening to whatever comes after, the insects took over the work of sound, and the door showed me its habit. It didn't just open, it opened twice. First a long, slow swing to the same place every time, then a pause like listening, then a smaller second open as if making room for someone thin to slip past without brushing shoulders. I chalked a shallow arc on the floor to see the truth of it and watched the door trace it like a compass. There's a grammar to old houses. They complain and then they rest. This door had time, wide, then narrower, question, then answer. I told myself the frame had learned a new geometry. The latch wanted mercy. That airflow is almost a personality in the mountains. The stove settled into a steady thought, and I let the room teach me what needed learning. Don't stare at the thing that wants your eyes. Keep your hands busy so your mind doesn't volunteer. I shaved kindling small as a bird's bones, mended a torn lace, counted the fire's ticks until I could hear the space between them. Around 2, the door rehearsed again. Wide, listen, narrow. The chair's front rung scraped forward a thumb's width on its own, just enough to clear the path of that second swing, and a draft crossed my ankles. Not cold, not warning, just occupied. The way a hallway feels when someone who belongs there walks through. I did not look up. You learn that young, if you grow up in hills like these. The mountain loves manners. The door eased back in two halves, and the latch clicked with a sound like a spoon finding the lip of a jar. A while later, it did it again and again, until the rhythm worked itself into me like a second pulse. I thought about nailing it shut. I even held the hammer before I knew what I was doing. It felt like loading a question I couldn't carry the answer to, so I put it down. Instead, I spoke the way you talk to a nervous animal. No names, no demands. Just a steady voice laid across a steady room. The door behaved, if you want to call it that. It kept to its two motions and never tried for a third. Somewhere past 3, I slept in the chair, boots on, coat over me, like an argument I hadn't decided to have. When I woke, the grey before light had edged the furniture, and the chalk lines were smudged into weather. The chair had returned itself against the wall, as if apologizing for work it hadn't been asked to do. I put my palm to the knob and felt warmth that didn't belong to stove or sun, not hot but shaped, the way brass learns the lesson of another hand. No print showed, nothing rude, but the metal held a memory of long fingers where the shine had thinned from years of use. Outside, the yard wore dew, honest and thick. My own boot tracks from the night before reached the threshold and then faded quick, like the cabin had decided not to keep anything of mine. On the steps, I found what I already knew would be there and still didn't want. One set of bare footprints, in the white, narrow and straight, as if the feet that made them had never learned to lie to leather. They moved away from the threshold parallel to where I walked, not touching, not crossing, and then they thinned toward the fern line, where the mountain keeps what it calls home. I swept the porch out of respect, closed the stove's mouth, and laid the chair on its side so the door wouldn't mistake help for argument. On the walk out, I kept feeling the polite brush of that draft at my ankles. As if a companion I couldn't name had matched my pace for a while and then stepped away before the road learned about us. That night, back where doors are square and latches are factory true, mine shut clean on the first try. Near morning, I woke to the sense of a hinge remembering two motions where one should do. I didn't get up. I lay still and let the house decide how to behave, and when the day came, it did. But I can't shake the feeling that somewhere a door is listening for my pause. And when I leave a room, it makes a second, smaller space for what follows me without needing to be seen.